A couple of months ago, I read you all a passage from Hideo Kojima's video game Bible. It's like the regular Bible, but it's sick and hates minorities. Today I'm going to share with you another passage. Any movement system in existence will, without exception, be improved by the addition of a grapple hook. Furthermore, any movement system with a grapple hook would be made worse if that mechanic were to be removed. At this point, grappling hooks are everywhere. Every game is getting a grapple hook. It's like a dedicated fun button, and it doesn't even take any skill from the player. It's the perfect crime. I don't really have a specific point to make about grappling hooks. I just kind of want to talk about them for 10 minutes. For me, the first game that comes to mind when I think of grappling hooks is Arkham Knight. Not only did this game make essentially every edge or ledge you find interactable with your back grapple, including indoor stealth sections, but it also expanded on Arkham City's understanding of inertia. The entire point of a grapple hook is to eliminate BS parkour, climbing, and running. It's to hypotenuse the shit out of your movement, so naturally you want a sense of continuing energy and momentum, which is why Knight implements an upgradable speed boost mechanic that lets you launch out of grapples at high speeds and weave it nicely into other movement options. There's no hitch involved. You're totally free to bounce around the city, just yay, wee, woo, woohoo, ah! You might think it's obvious to implement a level of inertia into your grapple mechanics because it plays so much smoother, but even today developers can overlook its importance despite its success in Arkham Knight, like for example, the very next game in the Batman universe. Gotham Knight's grapple hook ditches the speed boost mechanic from Arkham Knight altogether and instead just gives you a small kickoff from ledges, which constantly introduces a little pause into your traversal. It's like a Marquez Fultz free throw, just yeah. It's such an unnecessary backward step. The grapple is still useful, but it's not nearly as fun to use. Probably the series with the most freedom when it comes to grapple hooks, because it's almost entirely built around it, is Just Cause. The newer games let you attach onto really any part of anything, even if it's moving, and zip towards it. It's a fully realized 3D environment that is entirely interactable with your grapple. It's not just certain points. And as the series progressed, they also understood the importance of inertia, allowing you to switch out of a grapple into your parachute or wingsuit so you could stay airborne longer and not have to deal with smacking into walls or moving down to your significantly lower running speed. Everything you do in this game is in service of momentum and destruction, which meant they could spend a lot of time getting the grapple hook just right, and they had to because it informs a lot of the other mechanics and the world layout. If you sort of broaden the definition of what a grapple hook actually is, you can say the same thing about Spider-Man PS4. It took 3 full years for this game to get its swinging mechanics down because they wanted it to be physics-based and attached to actual objects when swinging, any object that was remotely vertical. Although when moving directly to points, it did, just like the Arkham games, limit this to vertices and ledges. There is a way to web sling onto flat surfaces, but it's slower and doesn't carry your motion very well. One other thing this game implemented is automatically transitioning to a wall run if you hit a surface coming off of a grapple. And actually, a lot of 3D titles that feature a grapple mechanic often tie them to wall runs. Shadow Warrior 3, Ghost Runner, Jedi Survivor, Ratchet & Clank. Wall runs are a nice intermediary point between grappling and getting your feet back on solid ground because it's not as jarring of a change in momentum and there's no mantling or hitches involved. It is also its own standalone mechanic though, as is the gliding in the Arkham games or the point launch in Spider-Man or the parachute in Just Cause. It's like the more integral grappling is to your movement, the less it can just be left on its own. It can definitely be a fun addition even in its most simple form. It's nice using it to hop between pillars in the new God of War or fling yourself around a little in Sekiro. But if you're developing a more robust movement system, you not only need to implement extra mechanics to help maintain motion to avoid something like Gotham Knights, but you also need to design your world around this feature and its particular limitations. Arkham Knight and Spider-Man take place in cities with a lot of edges and vertices. Even rounded structures have little statues or rods to attach to because they rely so heavily on these speed boosts and point launches. Just Cause has a lot of moving vehicles you can use for initial motion, and it's got hinky, unrealistic physics to counter its flatter areas, negating gravity during your zipline, for example, or sending you straight up when you open your parachute. If you don't accommodate for this kind of stuff, you end up with something like Halo Infinite. People generally like the grapple in Halo Infinite, and I think it's a good addition in combat, but it has a real lack of use cases when it comes to movement. Its open world Zeta Halo is largely flat, its vertical points are pretty spaced out, and there's no complementing movement features, just this thing on its own. Having airships flying around to attach to and catch a ride, or some sort of suspended objects to swing around on when in combat would be great ways to get more out of this system, but instead at most you're using this to move a little faster horizontally, get into cover quicker, or move up one floor. Again, it's not bad, it's just left on an island. Speaking of islands, let's talk about something completely unrelated. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, as much flack as it's been getting online, looks like it has an interesting spin on open world movement centered on grappling, one that isn't limited by the world design. Harley Quinn's grapple seems to be tied to a little drone that follows her around, which means she doesn't need to attach herself to actual points in the environment and has 100% freedom of movement wherever she goes. Now, I'm not sure if she's gonna have an option to also attach herself to points in the world or just to the drone. I don't know if it's gonna feel silly to play when it essentially looks like you're attaching yourself to thin air. And there are other questions with this game like, huh? And what? But I'm curious to see how this untethered means of swinging through the city feels to play. Climbing sections in games like Uncharted definitely benefit from grapple hooks as well. Uncharted has never had the most engaging climbing, it's mainly used for pacing and a sense of scale if anything, but the rope in Uncharted 4 allows for more daring escape scenes and is actually used sparingly in combat as well. Some combat arenas have points that you can swing on to get better vantage points, avoid gunfire, or attack enemies. There's honestly not much that I would change about Uncharted 4, but I do wish we saw a little more of this, because from my memory we only had a handful of encounters that actually implemented it, but the ones that did were far more free and dynamic than the others. A lot of games actually have started realizing that grapple hooks aren't just a traversal tool, they can be used directly in combat. Whether it's Shadow Warrior 3's hyper-designed combat arenas that always have a few points for you to swing around on while fighting, or games that feature direct grappling to enemies like Doom Eternal and Death's Door. Doom's is attached straight to your gun also, so it not only lets you use every enemy as a means for getting around its frantic, packed arenas, but it also lets you get as close as possible before you use your boomstick. And Death's Door takes a genre that's usually pretty slow-paced and methodical and injects it with much more energy in the later stages, creating combat set pieces. From this perspective, Halo Infinite's grapple is pretty solid actually. You can directly latch onto enemies and punch a gabagool in the face, you can snag weapons or explosives from far away, you can quickly find a good recovery point. It's a very helpful combat tool, even if using it to move around is super lame. Recently I've seen a lot of 2D games play around with this mechanic as well, and it's interesting seeing the differences in how they all play. Kunai, for example, is a game with a sort of dual grapple system, which means that you can do things like quickly scale up slender vertical sections by going left, right, but its level layouts are very cramped, which never lets the mechanic shine as much as it should. It always feels like the grapple is kind of a shortcut, but not actually necessary to get around, and you could hot swap it with some other ability without it changing too much. Like those long, slender vertical sections, if you had an infinite wall jump like a lot of other Metroidvanias, you'd be able to basically do the same thing. It's another example of how the actual levels don't back up the systems at play. Sanabi, on the other hand, has a much different sense of scale. It makes you very small and the stuff that you're exploring very big. It also limits what you can attach yourself to, but not by much. There are some surfaces that don't let you grab onto them, and you need to get around them by using abilities like your speed boost or this winch move. Or maybe the game will litter some floating objects for you to grab onto and leap off from. You can also only fight enemies with your hook. There's no shooting or melee combat. You need to orient yourself the right way, get an angle, and zip to enemies to kill them. Plus, you're able to choose which direction you'll leap out from when you kill them, so that means you can easily move back and forth and in circles without ever needing to touch a wall or floor. The hook in this game is very stiff, which makes it easy to predict, unlike another 2D game I played very recently called Rusted Moss. In this game, your grapple hook is kind of like a bungee cord. It has a lot of bounce to it, and you need to approach jumps very carefully. You need to work exact angles and let yourself get into a bit of a free fall before you latch onto a point to launch yourself upwards. It essentially turns the game into one big puzzle, and even though the enemies don't pursue you quite as aggressively and the game isn't as high tempo as Sanabi, it's actually a lot more intense when you're in combat because you need to try and be fast and precise to get to where you want to go. These two games really showcase how drastically a mechanic like this can transform off of a single decision. They're both 2D side-scrollers with traversal challenges and combat that relies on movement, but one gives you a rigid cable, the other one gives you an elastic band, and they play entirely different. Anyways, the man who's been holding a gun to my head off screen for the duration of this video is telling me that my time is up, so I hope you enjoyed. There's probably some buttons to click below. Bye, I guess. Maybe forever, I don't know. Let's see what this guy wants.